News Deck, never again. That's the two-word message from the thousands and thousands of students across the country who've walked out of classes, marching on capitals, demanding changes to our nation's gun laws, and threatening to remove politicians who refuse to address new gun control measures.
Students united will never be divided. We're students united will never be divided.
Students united, never be divided. That's students in Tallahassee just moments ago inside the state capitol. They're trying to get to the governor's office. Students coming out in force in the wake of last week's massacre in Parkland, Florida. Among them, students from Marjory Stoneman Douglas, the very school where 17 innocents died. Police say the gunman pulled a fire alarm, waited for his former classmates and teachers and others to gather in the halls, and then he gunned them down.
I'm here to demand change from our government, because the lives lost who shall not be lost in vain shall then be used as a catalyst for change in our country today. We will make change in this country, and if not today, tomorrow. And if not tomorrow, the day after that, and the day after that, until we achieve the change that we want in this country.
No one should ever have to go through what we went through. 17 of our classmates and teachers were murdered at the hands of a mentally unstable monster, something that easily could have been prevented by a proper background check and a mental health exam. An evil boy with a weapon of war took 17 people from their families.
I do not know exactly what needs to be done. I just know what we're doing now is nowhere near enough. If I have to keep seeing neighbors die, if I have to keep seeing friends die, and I have to keep seeing other people on the news deal with this same tragedy, they do not deserve this. America does not deserve this. Humanity does not deserve this.
Never again. Because never again should a child be afraid to go to school. Never again should students have to protest for their lives. Never again should an innocent life be taken while trying to gain an education. And never again should I feel guilty to be alive because Peter, Carmen, Scott, Feist, Hickson, Meadow, Jamie, Alyssa, Joaquin, Helena, Nick, Alana, Cara, Martin, Luke, Gina, and Alex are not.
And the children lead. Students from Parkland and other schools in Florida, including college students at the state capitol in Tallahassee. Some of the students who survived last week's shooting said they were awake nearly all night, traveling the 7 hours by bus, preparing for their meetings with lawmakers. They didn't rally, they met, they spoke, they listened. Those same young men and women dealing with the hate and baseless accusations on top of the harrowing ordeal they've already been through. It is unthinkable what's happening to them now. Conspiracy theorists are peddling lies that these students are simply political pawns, that activists are behind their protests. YouTube has now removed a video in which they suggested that one student was actually a crisis actor. That video was the top trending video on YouTube's list. Students not only having to respond to the lies and the hate, but people who say they're too young to have a full grasp of the big issues. And others who say because of what they went through, the students are just lashing out. But those very students who watch their friends die say they have every right to lead this charge.
A lot of people think that that disqualifies us from even having an opinion on this sort of matter. As if maybe because we've been through a traumatic experience that we don't know what we're talking about, that we're speaking irrationally. And I want everybody to remember that is not the case. We, more than anybody else, understand the violence that comes through certain guns. We, more than anybody else, understand what it feels like to lose somebody. We, more than anybody else, understand what it's like to have a beautiful community like Parkland and have it taken away from us by the media and by everyone else and by Nicholas Cruz, who just ruined its image. Parkland is a beautiful, safe town, and it is now ruined.
And as the students from Parkland made their way to Tallahassee, lawmakers in Florida voted down a measure to stop people from buying assault weapons like the one that investigators say the gunman used in Parkland. It didn't even come up for a vote in the State House. But in no way has that outcome hindered the demonstrations. This is Kentucky, where students are chanting "No more guns" as they walked out of classes today. They did this for 17 minutes. 1 minute for every one who died in Parkland. Similar scene in Minneapolis at high school where students walked out there. They marched to the city hall chanting "No guns in our schools" and in our nation's capital. Your hands, our blood, they chanted. Students on Capitol Hill trying to send their own message. And outside the White House, students holding another lie-in, a nod to all those killed by gun violence. Demonstrators are still out, even as schools close or get ready to dismiss for the day. Students screaming for change, concerned that lawmakers might simply turn the page again. We have Team Fox coverage. Our chief White House correspondent, John Roberts, on President Trump's sit-down with school shooting survivors in the last hour. But first, Rich Edson is on Fox Top Story. He's live in the Florida capital, Tallahassee. Rich, what are you hearing from these kids?
Chip, some of the Parkland students are telling us they fear as though their lobbying efforts have fallen short, that they have not convinced enough lawmakers to change the gun laws in the state of Florida. And so what do you do when that happens? You continue lobbying. They went back to the State House after a day of rallying, after a day of lobbying, and they are now inside and they are now chanting. They're chanting, "You work for us, vote them out. Where's Rick Scott, the governor of Florida, and hear us now." A massive rally on the steps of the old Florida State House right behind us here. That kicked off this morning into the afternoon. That included students from local high schools, from the high school in Florida, Parkland, Florida. Also, those from Florida State and other gun right activist groups or gun control activists who were here lobbying for gun control changes. Then inside the State House, that's where the students were pushing lawmakers and also, as you heard, recapping the tragic, life-changing events from a week ago and pushing representatives here to change Florida's gun laws.
The only reason that we've gotten so far is because we are not afraid of losing money. We are not afraid of getting reelected or not getting reelected. We have nothing to lose. The only thing we have to gain at this point is our safety.
The Senate President's Office tells us over the next couple of weeks, which is the remainder of the annual session here in Florida's legislature, that they will be working on some gun control measures, some school safety measures and mental health measures, but they only have a couple of weeks, then they are out for the year, Shep.
This has spread quickly, I guess, largely through social media.
It has. Those who organized the Women's March are now looking at a separate event on March 14th. That'll be 1 month since the shooting in Parkland, Florida, for students to walk out for 17 minutes, the number of students who were killed in that shooting last week. There is also an effort on April 20th to commemorate the 19-year anniversary of the Columbine High School shooting. And despite all of this, there is now a report out of Houston that a nearby Texas high school, the principal there, superintendent, is threatening to suspend students who demonstrate, who walk out of class, if they plan to do so. Shep.
Rich Edson in Tallahassee. President Trump's expected to meet in the next hour with survivors of gun violence, including more than a dozen students from Marjory Stoneman Douglas down in Parkland. The president said yesterday he's taking steps toward banning so-called bump stocks. And the president says he's asking the Justice Department to look into a way to ban all devices that turn legal weapons into machine guns, as the White House put it. Police say the Las Vegas shooter used bump stocks when he slaughtered more than 50 people at an outdoor music festival last fall. President Trump also says he's open to improving the background check system and raising the minimum age to buy a gun. A new poll from Quinnipiac University shows 97% of Americans favor mandatory background checks for all gun purchases. 97%, and yet we don't have it. We're not really close to it. The Democratic Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut co-sponsored the latest background check bill in the U.S. Senate. He says, and I'm quoting, "If this is all the White House is willing to do to address gun violence, it's wholly insufficient." Team Fox coverage continues. The chief White House correspondent, John Roberts, live on the North Lawn. John?
And the president's supposed to start that roundtable meeting at about 4:15 this afternoon in the state dining room. He will likely hear some of the same sort of impassioned pleas for change that we heard from Tallahassee and those students. Here's who's going to be attending: 15 to 20 students, teachers, and parents from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School there in Parkland. David Hogg, who you have seen on the air in many programs, including here on Fox News, was invited, but he wanted to go to the Tallahassee rally, so he is not coming here to the White House. As well, there will be members of Sandy Hook Promise. This is an advocacy group created by parents whose children were killed in Sandy Hook, Connecticut several years ago, as well as representatives from Rachel's Challenge, which aims to lower school violence, and students, teachers, and parents from the D.C. area, all of whom have some sort of experience with either gun violence or school violence in general. The president, we're told, is going to be in listening mode, listening to some ideas, though he does have some things that he's been kicking around already. One of them you mentioned at the top, Shep, considering raising the minimum age for buying a weapon. Currently under federal law, it's 21 for a handgun, 18 for a long gun, which includes rifles, including assault-style rifles and shotguns. We don't know what the president might consider raising that to, or really if he could do it, because much of this falls to the states. And the president may find himself in a position of advocacy more than anything on this particular issue. He also wants to look at ways to keep guns out of the hands of people who should never have them, mentally ill people. We've seen so many deranged shooters take so many lives in the last decades here in the United States. The president thinks that it's probably time to do something about that. And you mentioned, Shep, that he supports tightening up the background checks. He supports the Cornyn-Murphy bill, which would compel through an incentive in a series of incentives to have state and local officials and governments and agencies and federal agencies all report more efficiently and more effectively to the NICS system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. That really doesn't move the ball forward a whole lot more. You've been hearing these students calling for an assault weapons ban. That's likely not going to happen, and people who are against that would point to the fact that Columbine happened in the middle of the 1994 to 2004 assault weapons ban. Shep?
John Roberts on the North Lawn, thank you. Ahead, more on the new push for keeping children safe from shootings. We'll show you what's happening right now at the scene of the latest attack and what we've learned about the violent past.
Anti-gun slogans. We talked to a few of them and asked them why they were here today.
We know that we have very little power in like our government's legislature, but we know that as a people, we are strong. That's what our whole government's based on. We're the power of the people. And what the people want, people should get.
All the students walking miles to come over to Stoneman Douglas to make a difference. That's our voice.
That was a 10th grader and a 9th grader, age 15 and 14, both with a pretty clear idea of why they're here today, Shepard.
We had heard reporting along the way that this alleged shooter had been expelled from that school, but now we learn that's not true.
That's right. Nicholas Cruz, the suspected shooter, 19 years old, who's in solitary confinement now, was actually shuttled back and forth between 6 different schools during his time here in this area. At least one of those schools was for special needs. The problem with those schools are it often takes a great deal of paperwork, time, effort, and money to get someone into those schools, so there is a waiting list. One Florida school administrator said, just because you're afraid of a kid, it doesn't mean you can kick him out completely. Shepard?
Steve Harrigan at the school in Broward County. Ahead, the president set to sit down with students, parents, and teachers affected by some of the most tragic of all the attacks. As the White House considers taking action to change America's gun laws, could that happen? We'll look at what the White House and the Trump administration could possibly do from both political and legal. Building in Tallahassee. Students demanding change, demanding action. And they're asking, where's Rick Scott, the governor of the state of Florida?
Where's Rick Scott? 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 Where is he?
So, President Trump is set to meet in less than an hour from now with students, teachers, and parents all affected by some of the worst school shootings in modern world history, including some survivors. The White House says it's open to some tougher regulations on guns, but some gun control supporters say it's not enough. Let's turn to John Bussey, Fox News contributor, associate editor of the Wall Street Journal, with which this station shares common ownership, and Bob Bianchi, a defense attorney and former prosecutor. We'll talk about the news on this and the law on this. You were saying during the commercial break, this feels different from others of this kind?
Yeah. So after Vegas, what did we hear from the political infrastructure? Hey, let's not address this in the heat of the moment. Let's wait for, it's too soon. Let's wait for, tempers to calm down. And then guess what? It really wasn't addressed. It was kind of a method of sort of pushing it to the side. This time it looks like there's a bit more traction. These demonstrations in Florida, the visits to the White House. The question is how much of this is political theater, right? It's an observation on the part of our political structure that, hey, there does seem to be a little bit more traction. Moms and dads across the country are beginning to worry about sending their kids to school. That crosses...
Beginning to.
Exactly. That's we're well down that road, and we're reminded of that. And so this is an issue that crosses political lines very easily. So how much of this is kind of having people into the White House, observing this is really just a way of kind of having a political sop? Well, we'll find out. And how will we find out? The question will be what gets done. Bump stocks, is that going to be enough to placate a public that's getting more energized about this? That we've seen polls, people want tougher gun laws. Bump stocks were kind of an ancillary part of the debate. It's not the gun itself, it's not the age, it's not the background checks, it's not the more substantial gun control that a lot of gun control advocates are asking for.
The two matters, and Bob will get to you in a second, the two matters that the White House is discussing at this moment are two matters that the NRA has not come out in opposition to directly.
Yes, that's right. The NRA...
but there's nothing that they're coming out and saying, let's do this, that the NRA is against.
Yeah, I think that they're listening to the NRA. They're also listening to gun advocates in the United States, of which there are many, and who worry that, look, bump stocks may seem ancillary to you, but guess what? They're not. That's the beginning, the tipping point. Then there's a cascade of legislation that restricts how I'm allowed to use my weapon. So the White House is hearing all of that. And you're right, the bump stocks is just not going to be an issue as far as the NRA is concerned. The question will be whether or not these demonstrations and other political activity actually do get more traction, and whether this time parents are saying, I don't want more cops in the school. Yeah, that'll help to some extent, but are you talking to me about turning the hallways into shooting galleries? I want there to be something that reassures me that when I send my kid off to school, in the morning, that they are as safe as they possibly can be.
The Florida legislature and State House voted about 2-1 not to bring any sort of assault weapons ban to the floor, even for discussion. Legally speaking, what in Washington can be done?
Well, they're not going to be able to do anything to change the bump stock law, which is actually a legal device, because it still is a single fire, single trigger pull mechanism. This has been since 10 years, the decision of the ATF. So the ATF can't out-regulate the law. Congress passes the law, and the executive branch of government, which the ATF is part of, interprets it and regulates it. So some of these suggestions that we can get them to ban it is going to cause a multitude of lawsuits. And this is just a legal analysis from the manufacturers of those things. They're going to say, wait a minute, this is a lawful thing that's already been ruled lawful. And as a prosecutor, I look at it and say, where's the enforcement? I can't possibly go to trial with somebody who has a bump stock. Now, while on the other end, Shep, of that bump stock, sure, lots of rounds are being fired, but it's one round per trigger pull. I can't prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 jurors. It needs a congressional or legislative fix, period.
People who are against gun control are saying widely on social media and other places that the gun control left is using these students as sort of another weapon in their fight, that these students are being used as pawns.
Yeah. So this is a very emotional topic in the United States. Even without what just happened in Florida, the gun advocates and the gun control groups. And I think that you're seeing that accelerated and being even more inflammatory in the kind of remarks that you're seeing on social media, because this is an election year. We're in the middle of midterm elections. This is becoming a hotter button issue, and there are a lot of other hot button issues that the Republicans are concerned about, losing seats that might be on the edge, immigration issues, women's issues, now gun issues. They're beginning to stack up. You're seeing that reflected in the vituperative social media world.
You know, Shep, as a former head prosecutor, one thing that is just a legal analysis that used to drive us crazy is political correctness, whether it's left or right. We would just sit there and say, we need to do our job. Please stop politicizing laws. Please give us something that we can actually prosecute, not regulations and rules that are ineffective or unable to prosecute in a courtroom. And it would seem like politically, on both sides of the spectrum, I'm just a lawyer. I'm giving legal analysis. We would sit there when there was a proposal for new legislation and we would go, oh my God, now we're going to be left with the responsibility of carrying this out in a courtroom. And many times we couldn't because the legislation was completely ineffective. And we just used to be disgusted by how we were being twisted politically in the prosecutor's world. And I hope that that doesn't happen here.
You need something concrete.
Right.
Something enforceable. If the decision were made, we want to ban assault weapons, people don't like the phrase, but long guns of this kind, if they want to say, no longer are we going to allow people who are not old enough to buy a beer or not old enough to drive a car own one of these weapons, then you have to be specific about it, is what you're saying.
Well, I have to prove a case to a jury, to 12 people beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
And if there's confusion as to the law, every prosecutor knows already if it's really uncertain as to what the law is, the case probably won't even go to trial, or if it does, you're not going to be able to prove the case. So it needs to be certain, clear, so that prosecutors can do their job effectively.
Bob, John, thank you.
Gotcha.
The Reverend Billy Graham has died. A spokesman says the man often called America's pastor died at his home in North Carolina. He was perhaps most well-known evangelical leader in all the world with a commitment to preaching and activism. The Reverend Graham traveled the world, spreading his message to more than 210 million people through public appearances at the gatherings he called crusades, and to many more through telecasts, radio broadcasts. He also says the Trump Organization, which he now runs with his brother Eric, is actually missing out on business because his father promised the company would not make any new foreign deals while he's in office. Trump Jr. made these comments during an interview with a TV station in India. He's there promoting new Trump-branded luxury apartments. President Trump signed the deals before he won the White House, but some ethics groups now argue that the trip does raise some concerns. Benjamin Hall has the story. He's live in our London newsroom tonight. Benjamin?
Yeah, hi, Shep. Well, there has been a fair amount of controversy about this trip by Donald Trump Jr. You'll remember that 2 years ago, President Trump handed over control of his business empire to his two sons, and that was precisely to avoid conflict of interest between his new political life and his previous business career. Well, now as Donald Trump Jr. arrives in India to...